Hello, good morning, everyone. I have the real fortune in life to be a teacher. How many here are teachers? Okay, those of you who don't have your hand up, I'm afraid to tell you, you're wrong. Anybody who has a child, anybody who has a niece or nephew, anybody who has a good friend is a teacher. We all teach every day. I get to do it formally, which means I think about it quite a bit. And when I think about my role as a teacher, I think, okay, I teach psychology, so I have to teach psychology. But I also think there's something far more important, and that's to teach my students to think critically. Thinking critically is unnatural. It's not something we naturally do, but I think it's really important because it is what drives social change. So let me start with the unnatural. Critical thinking is unnatural. You guys have all come to this room with a bunch of beliefs, things you use to define your life, how you behave, how you act. Where did those beliefs come from? How many of those beliefs came from a deep analytic, engagement with research and thought that ultimately led you where you are? I suggest to you very few. That most of your beliefs came to you in a very different, much more natural way. So let's go to psychology, and let me point out a couple of psychological principles, please. The first one is something called observational learning, and I think this is actually the true foundation of the vast majority of the beliefs we hold. Think of it this way. A child is born into the world. They're starting to learn how to behave. On what basis do they behave? Well, they look around them. They have parents, they have family, they have social interactions, and the first thing they do is basically monkey see, monkey do. They watch what others around them are doing, and they imitate. They behave like they do. This was shown very strongly by experiment by somebody named Albert Bandura. In his sort of classic experiment, he had children watch cartoons. Half the children watched cartoons that depicted violent actions. The other half watched cartoons that did not depict violence. And then after that, they were allowed into a playroom that had a bunch of different toys available. Some of those toys were Bobo dolls. And you know Bobo dolls, those things you hit and they bounce, they come back up. And guns, toy guns. But there were also building blocks and other kinds of things. What he showed is those children who watched the violence, when they got into that playroom, they behaved much more violently. Simply by watching it, they did it. Okay, this is observational learning, and it's probably the core of most of our behaviors. We haven't thought about them, we just do them because those around us do them. Now, we probably tweak these behaviors a little bit. There's another major figure in psychology. Go ahead, sorry. I'll go this way, and then I can point to you. All right, B.F. Skinner. Skinner's he's sometimes known as the king of operant learning. Operant learning just says this, okay, I have this set of behaviors, but I've learned my behaviors in one context. And so if I go into a new context, they may or may not work. So I try them. Those behaviors that work, I stick with. Those that don't work, I modify. But again, this is something that's done in a very natural and without thought way. We just tweak our behaviors. So we start with observational learning, mimicking others, and then we tweak our behaviors a little bit based on the consequences of our actions, and we come to our current set of behaviors, whatever they are. Okay, now that's all well and good. Go ahead. But the point I want to make about this is that if this was all there was, if this was the only way we learned our behaviors, then we would become victims of what we could think of as behavioral inbreeding. We literally have society that we're mimicking, and now we would have a whole group of people who are essentially doing the same things because everybody else does it. That's okay unless what everybody's doing is for some reason suboptimal or unethical. In those situations, we need a way of somehow changing the way everyone's behaving. And that's where critical thinking comes into play. And that's what I want to focus on for the remainder of this talk. Go ahead. I want to give you an example, first of all, of this role of critical thinking in terms of social change. So I would like you all to imagine yourselves as white people living in the southern part of America somewhere around 1800s, early 1800s. A time where slavery was dominant. In fact, at that point in America, there were more slaves in the southern part of America than there were white people. But imagine yourself in that situation. Everybody you know has slaves. Your parents have slaves, your friends' parents have slaves, your uncle, your aunt, etc., and they all treat their slaves like possessions. So if we first come back to the unnatural issue, what do you think you would do? How do you think you would feel? What do you think you would believe about slavery? Well, history suggests that, generally speaking, most of us would think it's okay. It's cool. In fact, most of us wouldn't think it's okay. Most of us wouldn't think at all. We would simply accept it. It would just be normal. But here's where the hero of my story comes in. The hero is going to need teams eventually. But the first hero I want to talk about is somebody I want to call the opinion oddball. I celebrate opinion oddballs. But opinion oddballs need good critical thinking skills to be successful. The opinion oddball is somebody who is in that situation and for whatever reason looks around them, thinks about what's going on, and comes to the conclusion that society as a whole is not thinking right. There's something wrong with what's going on here. And let me give you a sense of how an opinion oddball might have come about in the southern part of America at the time of slavery. This was a time when America and England were, having all these pains. So the British still wanted a lot of control over America. And in fact, there's some kind of ironic quotes that suggest that the American leadership is saying, you guys are treating us like we're your slaves, but we're not your slaves. And in fact, the ultimate kind of middle finger to Britain at the time was something called the Declaration of Independence. And of course, the classic line from the Declaration of Independence says, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these are the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." This was America talking to Britain. We, Americans, have these rights. This is what we believe in. This is what defines who we are. Now let's imagine our opinion oddball in the southern part of the States looking at this and saying, well, if that's who we are, we can't accept slavery. This goes against owning a slave. They as well deserve the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This is data. This is now the beginning of the formation of an argument. And this opinion oddball uses the critical thinking skills they have to try to change society on a whole because society doesn't want to change. Okay? One of the things about these natural processes that lead to our beliefs is they give us a lot of warmth, a lot of comfort. It's a form of indoctrination. And once indoctrinated, we know how to behave in a manner that the rest of society will be comfortable with. And so we like to behave in those ways. And when someone comes and tells us we have to change our behavior, that's extremely uncomfortable. And you can feel it. And I want you to feel it. So I want to move to a slightly different example now. And I'm intentionally going to try to make some of you in this room quite uncomfortable. So the example is mostly an example. But what I want you to do is listen to this and feel what you're feeling inside. As I expose you to this situation. The example is going to focus on what you eat every day. Specifically, for those of you who eat meat, this practice that humans have en masse of eating meat. Let's go back to our natural ways of learning. I'm of Dutch heritage. We had meat and potatoes as a staple of every meal we had. Okay? It was just natural. I was indoctrinated into that kind of conception. Now, of course, meat was produced in nice little farms, right? More traditional farms at the time. If you go to a restaurant, of course, it's very normal to eat meat. Everybody's eating meat around you. It's one of those situations where, by that classical indoctrination path, it follows very naturally that everybody would just go ahead and do what everybody else is doing without much thought. But now, if you're like me, for 40 years, I don't know if maybe 30 years, I don't know how much I heard about this when I was 10 years old, but at some point I would hear these rumblings. You should know more about where your meat comes from. You should look into this. You owe it to yourself. Kentucky Fried Chicken has these horrible places. You should look into that. And like most people, I didn't for many, many years. In fact, I would largely say it was a change in my local social context that made that almost safe. Specifically, my wife who's very empathetic to animals and would constantly raise these issues. And at some point, I'm like, okay, I can't keep just going, I'm going to have to look into this. I'm going to have to find out what's going on. And I started reading some things about it. And I want to tell you just a couple of factoids. Again, feel what you're feeling as I do this to you. Okay, first one. Actually, yeah, again. 99. What's 99? 99% of the livestock raised in North America is raised in factory farms. So 99% of the meat we eat in North America is factory farmed. It's not that high all through the world, but it's probably higher than you think everywhere. This was certainly much higher than I think. We see the nice little farms on the road. We don't see the factory farms. And that's not a coincidence. They don't want us to see the factory farms. So we see the farms. That's where we think the animals come from. This was a shock to me. 99%. You mean all the meat in the supermarket? You mean all the meat in the restaurants? Yeah. If you want that other 1%, you got to go looking for it. Okay, and if you're not looking for it, that's where the meat's coming from. Okay, well, what does that mean? All right, so now I'm starting to put myself in touch with other opinion oddballs, other people who have talked about this and learned from them. And I learned that there's actually 3 kinds of issues related to meat consumption that I should be thinking about. I'm not going to go through all these data, but I'll highlight one for each. So let's go ahead through. And one more. Al Gore, king of the environmental protection sort of act, you could say. Well, kind of funny, Al Gore consumes meat. He's never quit eating meat, despite facts like the following. Throw them up there. Factory farming condenses a whole bunch of animals in a very small area. And one of the results of that is it produces a whole lot of methane gas. In fact, 37% of methane emissions come from factory farms. And these methane emissions are 20 times more negatively affecting in terms of global warming than our CO2 emissions. In fact, in a 2006 UN report, this is not PETA, this is UN, they reported that if you compared factory farm emissions to the emissions from all forms of transportation combined, factory farming emissions are worse. So you hear about changing mileage on cars, that's a tiny little thing compared to what factory farming is doing. And you see some of these other facts too, showing the negative effects of factory farming on the environment. Let me just highlight the one on the bottom of this. The average animal intakes about 5 grams of protein for every 1 gram you get out of it. It's a very inefficient source of protein. If we wanted protein, if that's why we're eating meat, we'd be far better off, for many environmental reasons, to go right to the source. Okay, let's go to the next one. What about health? Well, health, the story's a little more mixed. Well, it's not really mixed. Go ahead. Depending on, when you look at studies, vegetarians live about 7 years longer, vegans 15 years longer than meat eaters. This could be due to a variety of reasons. I mean, the dietary information is the primary. Maybe they drink less, maybe they exercise more, but still, there's suggestion that something's there. But most of that's all about red meat. Okay, in terms of health, it's the eating of red meat that's really negatively affecting your health. It doesn't matter where that red meat came from, factory farms or not. But still, another reason that it would be good to avoid eating meat if you're worried about health. And of course, the primary reason, if you consider yourself an animal lover, we all say this, many people say it on their way to McDonald's. I'm an animal lover. In fact, there's a famous study where they interviewed people in McDonald's who profess to being animal lovers. But this is really what gets most of us worked up about factory farming, right? Because if we look at some of the facts, I mean, it's just a basic tenet that the goal of every factory farm is to maximize yield and minimize cost. And they do that by making these animals as large as they possibly can with growth hormones, which tends to make the animals very unhealthy, but they combat that with daily antibiotics, and then they house them in tiny, tiny facilities that produce all this methane, okay? It's been said, and from everything I've seen, and I don't want to get graphic or emotional, I will say there's a video on YouTube called Meet Your Meat. If you believe I'm being overdramatic, watch that video. But it's been said that the best day of any animal's life in a factory farm is the day of its death. Okay? It's just basically born into suffering. And as I think about all these things, a sort of core moral compass I have is I do not want to intentionally cause unnecessary suffering. if I know that any choice that I'm making is intentionally causing unnecessary suffering, then that choice is wrong for me. And when you look at factory farming through those eyes, with that lens on, then we know that humans are intentionally causing unnecessary suffering on the scale of billions of animals per year. Okay. How do you feel? When a cold air mass hits a hot air mass, we get thunderstorms, we get lightning. When an opinion oddball uses critical thinking to attack your indoctrinated beliefs, you get that. You get what you feel right now. Ugh. And then the question is, what do you do about that? How many people, after just hearing me spout off about this stuff, can't wait to talk to me in the hallway and tell me all the ways I'm wrong, or get into more details? Okay, if that's how you feel, excellent. Excellent. Because the goal of every critical thinker should not be to make other people think what they think. It should be to make other people think. Okay? That's the goal. And that's my goal in every talk, to stimulate discussion, to stimulate thought. Because the other reaction, which is often far more common, is to retreat to the indoctrinated beliefs. Now, stimulating thought isn't easy. It requires that teamwork. It requires that critical mass of thinkers to come together. But it can have a big impact. If we return to slavery, think about what happened with respect to slavery. In fact, think about it with respect to our recent story about the workers at Qatar for the World Cup who are being treated like slaves. And we all read that and go, that's wrong. That's how far we've come since the 1800s. And we've come there because of a bunch of critical thinkers who got together, eventually created a civil war, and decades later changed what is our basic way of thinking about how humans react to each other. I would love it if we also changed how we react to animals. Two roads diverged in the wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. Thank you.